Good afternoon. I am Early Sol from the Division of Professional Education at the College of Arts and Sciences of the University of the Philippines, Visayas. We in our team, composed of Donne, Jessie, Jonevee, and myself, are pleased to share with you a part of the project that we started in response to the pandemic. Our presentation this afternoon is entitled Can Schools Keep Up? Insights from a webinar series that used an evolving heuristic framework for in service teachers to imagine the pedagogy of the new normal. The Philippine educational system first felt the brunt of the COVID-19 pandemic back in March of this year when classes came to a grinding halt in most parts of the country due to community lockdowns that were imposed in the hopes of mitigating the effects of a disease that grossly affected the world. In the Philippines, the school year for basic education is divided into quarters, starting in June and going on until March of the following year. Because these community lockdowns meant that people were prohibited from leaving their homes and gathering in large crowds, this effectively suspended classes in all levels of education. For most schools, the fourth quarter was examination was canceled and students' grades had to be computed, adjusting for these circumstances. Moving up and graduation rites that necessitated assemblies were prohibited. As community lockdowns dragged on for a month, and with COVID 19 cases still rising in April, it was starting to become clearer that the school year that was supposedly starting in a few weeks' time will not be anything like the ones that came before it. Moreover, this was usually around the time when members of our team extended our services in organizing and facilitating in service teacher training programs. As such, our team decided to organize a series of webinars that would assist teachers in making sense of what happened, what was happening, and what was bound to happen in light of the health disaster. Much like what we did during the previous summers, only this time, interactions, discussions, and workshops were going to be completely online. We designed these webinars as conversations among in service teachers who are among the biggest and yet most often the most silenced stakeholders in the Philippine educational system. We imagined these conversations to encourage them into thinking, talking, planning, and working our ways forward. Moreover, we thought that it would be a good idea to use a bottom up approach in solving this kind of problem rather than the usual top to bottom tradition. So, in between April and June of this year, we were able to conduct a total of 9 sessions to some 427 participants, a mix of school teachers, school administrators, graduate and high school students, and even those working in the industry and the media. 364 of these participants were in service teachers with a great percentage teaching in the basic education level. They are the focus of this particular part of the study. Each webinar session lasts for 2 hours. These sessions included breaks, games, open forums, and breakout sessions in between. We utilized the Zoom platform for our sessions. While our participants have had one or two webinars prior to ours, it was everybody's first time to engage in an interactive webinar with integrated workshops. Thus, our sessions spent quite a significant amount of time doing tech checks and assisting participants in using the Zoom platform as well as the other online apps that we used. Now, participants were encouraged to answer our interactive questions using various platforms like Slido and Kahoot, because the Department of Education had already floated the idea of using online mechanisms to deliver instruction. We wanted the teachers to try the online setting themselves so that they would get to be in their students' shoes, so to speak. Well, these webinars possibly the first of their kind in a country beset with slow internet connection and schools with limited technological resources, offered a heuristic framework for teachers to consider that could help them compare and contrast the old normal pedagogy with their notions of what ought to be the new normal pedagogy, considering the impending reopening of schools. They were invited to consider the three main components and subcomponents of the framework: assumptions, approaches, and assessments. Initial entries to the framework that were based on a consensus among the researchers were presented to the various groups of webinar participants. The evolving nature of this heuristic framework was explained to them, highlighting how its collaborative design may allow components to be changed accordingly. After a brief talk on the proposed analytical framework, participants were divided into smaller groups in breakout sessions. They were then asked to fill in the template that aims to generate ideas in further developing the tentative framework. These breakout sessions were facilitated by one of our team members, and each group organized their breakout groups to re examine the proposed analytical framework. Each participant was asked to fill the old normal, new normal matrix, a sample provided here, to provide us an understanding of how the participants view the analytical framework, considering their experience in the old normal and what they expect in the new normal. Their answers were discussed and threshed out during the breakout sessions. The participants also articulated what needs to be stopped, started, continued, or changed, putting into equation the context of this pandemic. Transcripts and filled out activity sheets from the webinar series were collected, organized, and subjected to thematic analysis. The data analysis process, which included thematic analysis leading to the development of categories and themes, uh, was iterative and tempered by incidents and insights from our field notes and other gathered forms of documentation from each of us who facilitated the webinar series. Based on the results of the data analysis, there were three key themes that we would like to highlight. Number one, implementing new approaches and assessment. Number two, schools' readiness, adaptability, and availability of resources. And number three, changes in the framework. Data from the initial analysis revealed that while participants expressed general sentiment or general agreement with the changes on educational goals, the nature of learners, teacher roles, and educational values, their concerns were mainly on how they could institutionally implement the prospective new approaches and means of assessment. Participants often referred to how their approaches and assessment will ultimately depend on what the Philippine Department of Education will prescribe. These led them to believe that even if they had their own ideas of more suitable approaches and assessment strategies, they will still be limited by government mandates as well as the resources available to them and their learners. And now, aside from general structural, logistical, and organizational unpleasantness of the school year to adjust to the new normal, the impediment rather that is even more challenging is the old logic and culture that pervade the system. Teachers generally appreciate that they need to have some form of instructional leadership or initiative, But the culture in schools have been organized in such a way that most of them feel that their work is basically just implementation. Thus, we often get webinar expectations of how to teach in the new normal or what strategies to use, etc. These are practical and valid concerns, but this also reveals old logic founded on the assumption that what is needed are just new approaches, strategies, and techniques. Another result that is highlighted here is that while teachers think that changes in assumptions, approaches, and assessment have long been overdue, even before the pandemic, they were not entirely convinced of their school's readiness, adaptability, and resources in adhering to these assumptions, implementing these approaches, and instituting these assessment strategies and practices. Remember that this study was done back in May, when webinars or online conferences were far from the norm for teachers who come from a developing country like the Philippines. Most people use the internet for social media and perhaps the occasional Googling of information. So, new modes of learning like modular, online, and blended learning were very new for teachers and learners who, prior to the pandemic, had already been struggling with the lack of textbooks and the less than suitable learning materials that were available to them. Now, teachers and learners' usual problems will be compounded by the lack of technology and poor internet infrastructure in many parts of the country. Finally, data from participants' activity sheets, as well as the discussions that emerged during the workshops, led to changes in the framework that was initially developed. We have revised the framework to reflect the following. Under assumptions, what counts as official school knowledge, power, control, and culture, and role and capacities of families and communities. Under approaches, the nature of curricular development and implementation, disruption, upheavals and changes, reforms and innovations, and finances, resources, and economic context and considerations. And lastly, under assessment, parameters and procedures, standards of quality assessment, players and their roles, and feedback and accountability. To date, this project is still ongoing, and we are looking for more spaces and places for conversations and rethinking about education in the new normal and how this framework may evolve. A lot of things have happened in the months since we conducted our interactive webinar workshop series. The Department of Education has implemented a reduction in learning competencies that will be covered by each discipline. This new set is now dubbed the most essential learning competencies. Secondly, rather than starting in June, the school year started during the first week of October, thus marking a shift in the academic calendar for basic education in the country. Third, different towns are now implementing varied modes of delivery of instruction based on the general needs and resources of their learners. Right now, there is absolutely no face to face instruction. Rather, instruction is delivered through modules, online schemes, and blended learning schemes. Fourth, new modes of assessment have also been put in place to take into consideration the absence of physical face to face interaction. And finally, with all the ongoing developments, many things remain to be uncertain. With the stark and dire conditions of their learners and even of themselves as teachers, the underlying power dynamics that sets what is to be taught, how to teach it, and how to assess who gets to avail of a certain mode of learning or which constraints prevents equitable access to learning. All of these have become even more apparent in the design of teaching and learning processes. The teachers openly acknowledge these gaps and inconsistencies as they buckle down to embrace new and more tasks. Well, to close, we are hopeful that just as our engagement in offering an in service training online proved to generate helpful data in developing a framework for teaching and learning, we hope that teachers and learners will likewise be able to adapt to learning and teaching in the conditions that we are in, and that for all our sakes, we will all be able to keep up. That marks the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for listening. Do reach out to us through the email address on the screen, and we will be happy to engage in conversations with you. Thank you so much, and good afternoon.